Margaret wiped the sweat from her forehead as she finished checking on the last patient in the high-security medical wing. At 67 years old, she had dedicated 43 years of her life to nursing, most of them spent in this maximum security prison facility. The gray walls and heavy metal doors had become as familiar to her as her own home, but lately, something felt different. The prison housed some of the most dangerous criminals in the country, but Margaret had always believed that every person deserved compassionate medical care, regardless of their crimes. This philosophy had earned her respect from both inmates and staff, though it sometimes put her at odds with the harsh realities of prison life. As she walked down the dimly lit corridor, her soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper on the polished floor, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching her. The prisoners called her Nurse Maggie, and over the years she had treated everything from minor cuts to serious illnesses. She never asked about their crimes, never judged them for their past actions. To her, they were simply human beings in need of medical attention. The evening shift was beginning, and Margaret was preparing to hand over her duties to the night nurse when Warden Collins approached her with an unusual request. His face was stern, more serious than usual, and his voice carried an edge that made Margaret's stomach tighten with unease. "Margaret, I need you to do something for me," he said, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "There's a situation in cell block D that requires your immediate attention. It's complicated." Cell block D was different from the rest of the prison. It was where they kept the most violent and unpredictable inmates, those who had proven too dangerous for general population. Margaret had only been there a handful of times in her career, and each visit had left her deeply unsettled. The warden explained that there had been an incident involving one of the inmates in the maximum security section. Someone had been injured and they needed her expertise immediately. What he didn't tell her was that the injured person wasn't an inmate at all, but rather a guard who had been attacked during a routine cell check. As they walked through the increasingly secure sections of the prison, passing through multiple checkpoints and locked doors, Margaret began to feel a growing sense of dread. The air seemed thicker here, heavy with tension and the weight of contained violence. The guards they passed looked nervous, their hands resting on their weapons as if expecting trouble at any moment. When they finally reached cell block D, Margaret was surprised to see how many additional security personnel were present. Riot gear hung ready on hooks along the walls, and the usual background noise of the prison had been replaced by an eerie silence that made her skin crawl. "The situation is in cell 47, Warden Collins informed her, his voice now barely above a whisper. "The inmate there is particularly dangerous. We've had to take special precautions." Margaret had heard whispers about cell 47 over the years. It was spoken of in hushed tones like a ghost story that no one quite believed but everyone feared might be true. The inmates called whoever lived there the Dragon, though Margaret had always assumed it was just prison folklore, the kind of legend that grew in places where hope was scarce and fear abundant. As they approached the cell, Margaret could see why it had earned such a fearsome reputation. The door was reinforced with additional steel plating, and there were multiple locks and security measures that she had never seen before. Small windows were covered with thick reinforced glass and warning signs were posted at regular intervals. The warden's explanation became more detailed as they got closer. The inmate inside had been convicted of multiple violent crimes and had proven impossible to manage through conventional means. He had injured several guards over the years and had shown no signs of rehabilitation or remorse. The prison administration had been forced to implement extraordinary security measures just to contain him. Margaret's medical bag felt heavier in her hand as she realized the gravity of the situation. She was being asked to enter. The injured guard was apparently still inside the cell, having been overcome during what should have been a routine medical check. The inmate had barricaded himself inside and was refusing to allow anyone to help the wounded man. "Why me?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Why not call for a medical emergency team or negotiate with specialists?" Warden Collins looked at her with a mixture of desperation and hope that she had rarely seen in his typically stern demeanor. "Because he asked for you specifically. He knows your reputation, knows that you treat everyone fairly. He says he'll only allow you inside to treat the guard." The weight of responsibility settled on Margaret's shoulders like a heavy blanket. Somewhere behind that reinforced door was a man who needed medical attention, possibly fighting for his life. Her oath as a nurse compelled her to help, regardless of the circumstances or the danger to herself. As the final preparations were made and the security protocols were explained to her, Margaret took a deep breath and prepared herself for what might be the most challenging situation of her entire career. She had no way of knowing that in just 30 minutes, everything she thought she knew about human nature, justice, and redemption would be forever changed. The heavy keys turned in the multiple locks, each click echoing through the corridor like a countdown to an uncertain fate. Margaret stepped forward, her medical training taking over as she focused on the task ahead, unaware that she was about to witness something that would challenge everything she had come to believe about the people society had labeled as monsters. The cell door opened with a grinding sound that seemed to echo through Margaret's bones. As she stepped inside, the first thing that struck her was not the man they called the Dragon, but the overwhelming sense of controlled chaos that filled the small space. Books were stacked neatly on every available surface, their pages yellowed with age and constant handling. Mathematical equations covered portions of the walls, written in small, precise handwriting that spoke of an organized mind. In the corner of the cell, slumped against the wall, was guard Thompson. Margaret had known him for 15 years, had treated his wife during a difficult pregnancy, and had watched his children grow up through the photos he proudly displayed in the staff break room. Now he lay unconscious, a deep gash across his forehead and his breathing shallow but steady. Standing between Margaret and the injured guard was the man everyone feared. Marcus Chen was not what she had expected. Rather than the hulking brute she had imagined, he was of average height and build, with intelligent dark eyes and graying hair that suggested he was somewhere in his 50s. His movements were careful and deliberate, like someone who had learned to control every aspect of his physical presence. "Thank you for coming. Nurse Margaret," he said quietly, his voice carrying an unexpected gentleness. "I know this situation must be frightening for you, but I need you to understand that Guard Thompson's injury was an accident. I would never intentionally harm someone who was simply doing their job." Margaret's medical training took over as she assessed the situation. Thompson needed immediate attention, and regardless of how he had been injured, her priority was clear. She moved toward him slowly, keeping her hands visible and her movements non-threatening, though she wondered if such precautions were even necessary given Marcus's calm demeanor. "What happened here?" she asked as she knelt beside Thompson, opening her medical bag and beginning her examination. The wound was serious but not life-threatening if treated promptly. Marcus remained where he was, giving her space to work, but staying close enough to continue their conversation. Thompson came in for the routine medical check as scheduled, but when he saw me reading, he became agitated. He started shouting about how criminals like me didn't deserve books, didn't deserve education. He tried to take my mathematics textbook away. As Margaret cleaned Thompson's wound, she listened to Marcus's account with growing confusion. The man before her spoke with the vocabulary and cadence of someone highly educated, his explanation rational and measured. This wasn't matching the violent monster she had been led to expect. I tried to explain that the books were part of my rehabilitation program, that I had been working on advanced mathematics problems as a way to keep my mind occupied. Marcus continued, but he became more aggressive, started threatening to have all my books removed. When he reached for my notebooks where I keep years of work, I reacted. Margaret applied pressure to stop the bleeding while preparing sutures. "You reacted how?" I pushed him away from my desk. I didn't mean for him to fall and hit his head on the edge of the bed frame. It was instinctive, protective. Those notebooks contain mathematical proofs I've been working on for over a decade. They represent the only meaningful thing I've been able to accomplish in this place. As she worked to close the wound, Margaret found herself studying Marcus more carefully. His hands, which everyone feared as weapons, were actually covered in small scars from years of careful work. Ink stains marked his fingers, evidence of countless hours spent writing and calculating. The cell around them, which she had expected to be a chaotic mess, was actually meticulously organized. "You're a mathematician?" she asked, focusing on her medical work while trying to process this unexpected revelation. "I was a professor before I ended up here," Marcus replied, his voice carrying a weight of regret that seemed to fill the small space. "I taught advanced calculus and theoretical mathematics at the university." "It seems like a lifetime ago now." Margaret finished suturing the wound and checked Thompson's vital signs. He was stable and beginning to show signs of regaining consciousness. As she worked, She became increasingly aware of the disconnect between the man sitting quietly in the corner and the dangerous criminal that the prison staff had described to her. "Why do they call you the Dragon?" she asked, genuinely curious now rather than afraid. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret could see pain flash across his features. "Because when I first arrived here, I was angry. Furious at the world, at the system, at myself. I fought against everything and everyone. I hurt people because I was hurting, and I didn't know how else to express the rage I felt inside." He gestured toward the books and papers that surrounded them. "It took me years to understand that violence was just another prison, one I was building around myself. These books, this work, they became my way out of that anger. Mathematics doesn't lie, doesn't judge, doesn't care about your past mistakes. It just is." Thompson stirred slightly, a soft groan escaping his lips as consciousness began to return. Margaret immediately focused her attention on him, checking his pupils for signs of concussion and monitoring his responses. He would need to be taken to the medical facility for observation, but he was going to be fine. "Will he be okay?" Marcus asked, and Margaret was surprised to hear genuine concern in his voice. "He'll recover completely," she assured him. "Head wounds always look worse than they are because they bleed so much. He might have a headache for a few days, but there's no permanent damage." As she prepared Thompson for transport, Margaret found herself looking at Marcus with new eyes. The man before her was clearly intelligent, articulate, and capable of remorse. Whatever crimes had brought him to this place, he had clearly undergone some kind of transformation during his time here. "Why did you ask for me specifically?" she finally asked as they waited for the medical team to arrive. Marcus smiled slightly, the first time she had seen any warmth in his expression. "Because everyone in this place talks about Nurse Margaret, who treats everyone the same, who sees the person behind the crime. I thought if anyone would listen to my side of what happened, it would be you. I thought you might understand that people can change, even people like me." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor, indicating that help was arriving. Margaret realized that her time alone with Marcus was almost over, and with it, perhaps her only chance to truly understand the man behind the fearsome reputation. What she had discovered in the last 20 minutes had challenged everything she thought she knew about justice, rehabilitation, and the capacity for human change. As the medical team carefully transported Thompson out of the cell, Margaret found herself lingering longer than necessary. The warden had expected her to leave immediately once the injured guard was stable, but something about Marcus and his story had captured her attention in a way she couldn't quite explain. "You don't have to stay," Marcus said gently, noticing her hesitation. "I'm sure they're expecting you to leave now that the emergency is over." But Margaret was looking at the mathematical equations covering the walls, trying to make sense of the complex formulas and diagrams that surrounded them. "These equations," she said, pointing to a particularly intricate section. "What are they for?" Marcus's eyes lit up with an enthusiasm she hadn't seen before. "That's part of a proof I've been working on for the past 8 years. It's related to number theory, specifically prime number distribution. The mathematics community has been trying to solve this particular problem for over a century." Margaret moved closer to examine the work, though the mathematical concepts were far beyond her understanding. What she could see was the incredible dedication and precision that had gone into every calculation. "You've been working on this for 8 years? By yourself?" "Completely by myself," Marcus confirmed. "I don't have access to current mathematical journals or research databases. I don't know what progress others might have made on similar problems. I'm working with textbooks that are 20 years old, and whatever mathematical knowledge I can remember from my teaching days." The scope of what he was attempting began to dawn on Margaret. Here was a man, isolated from the academic world, working on problems that challenged the brightest minds in mathematics, using nothing but outdated books and his own intellect. "How do you even know if you're on the right track?" Marcus walked over to another section of the wall where he had created what appeared to be a complex flowchart. "I've developed my own system of checks and balances. Every step has to be verified multiple times using different approaches. If I can arrive at the same conclusion through 3 different mathematical paths, then I know I'm probably correct." Margaret followed his explanation as he pointed out different sections of his work. His passion for mathematics was evident in every gesture, every carefully chosen word. This was clearly more than just a way to pass time in prison. It was a genuine intellectual pursuit that had given his life meaning and purpose. Before I came here, Marcus continued, I was considered one of the leading experts in my field. I had published papers, won awards, given lectures at conferences around the world. I thought that was all gone forever when I was convicted. But mathematics. Mathematics doesn't care about your past. It only cares about whether your logic is sound and your calculations are correct. Margaret sat down on the small chair beside his desk, which was covered with notebooks filled with neat handwriting and detailed diagrams. What brought you here, Marcus? What happened to change your life so completely? For the first time since she had entered the cell, Marcus's composure faltered slightly. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands as if gathering the courage to speak about something he rarely discussed. I lost my family in a car accident, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. My wife and 2 young daughters. The other driver was drunk, had multiple previous convictions, but he had somehow avoided serious jail time. The legal system failed them, failed me. Margaret felt her heart sink as she began to understand the tragedy that had led this brilliant man to prison. What did you do? I found him, Marcus said simply. I spent months planning. I used my knowledge of chemistry, my understanding of mathematical probability, to create what I thought would be the perfect crime. I wanted him to suffer the way my family had suffered. I wanted justice that the courts couldn't or wouldn't provide. The weight of his confession hung in the air between them. Margaret could see the pain and regret etched in every line of his face, the heavy burden of choices that had destroyed not just his victim's life, but his own as well. I succeeded in my plan, Marcus continued. But I also discovered something I hadn't anticipated. Revenge didn't bring my family back. It didn't ease my pain. It only created more suffering, more destruction. I had become the very thing I was trying to punish. Margaret reached out and touched one of his notebooks, feeling the worn edges that spoke of countless hours of work and contemplation. And the mathematics? When did that begin? About 5 years into my sentence, Marcus explained. I was still angry then, still fighting everyone and everything. I spent most of my time in solitary confinement. One day a volunteer brought some old textbooks to the library, including an advanced calculus book. I picked it up thinking it might help me remember who I used to be. He gestured around the cell at the years of work that surrounded them. Instead, it helped me discover who I could become. The problems in that book led to more complex questions, which led to research into unsolved mathematical theorems. For the first time since the accident, I had something constructive to focus my mind on. Margaret was beginning to understand the transformation that had taken place within these walls. The other inmates, the guards, they don't know about your work, do they? Marcus shook his head. Most of them wouldn't understand it even if I tried to explain. To them, I'm still the dragon, the violent criminal who hurt people when he first arrived. It's easier for everyone if I maintain that reputation. It keeps people away and gives me the solitude I need to work. But you're not that person anymore, Margaret observed, looking around at the evidence of intellectual growth and personal development that filled every corner of the cell. No, Marcus agreed quietly. I'm not. But the person I was, the crime I committed, those things don't just disappear because I've changed. I still have to live with what I did, still have to serve my sentence. The mathematics doesn't erase the past. It just gives me hope for a different kind of future. Margaret realized that she was witnessing something remarkable. Here was a man who had taken the worst experience of his life and used it as the foundation for extraordinary personal growth. The isolation and restrictions of prison had become the laboratory where he had rebuilt himself from the ground up. As she prepared to leave, Margaret knew that this encounter had changed her understanding of redemption, rehabilitation, and the potential for human transformation. The mathematical equations on the walls weren't just academic exercises. They were a map of one man's journey from destruction to creation, from violence to intellectual beauty. Over the following weeks, Margaret found herself thinking about Marcus and his mathematical work more often than she cared to admit. The image of those wall-covered equations haunted her thoughts during quiet moments, and she began to research the mathematical concepts he had mentioned during their conversation. What she discovered astonished her. The problems Marcus was working on were indeed among the most challenging in modern mathematics. She found references to similar work being done by teams of researchers at prestigious universities, with million-dollar prizes offered for solutions to some of the theorems he was attempting to prove. Margaret began to realize that she might be witnessing something historically significant happening within the walls of the prison. A brilliant mind working in complete isolation was potentially making breakthroughs that could advance human knowledge in ways that few people would ever appreciate or understand. The idea that came to her was both simple and revolutionary. What if Marcus didn't have to work in complete isolation? What if there was a way to connect his work with the broader mathematical community without compromising prison security or revealing his identity? Margaret spent several evenings researching academic protocols and correspondence methods. She learned about mathematical journals, peer review processes, and the way researchers traditionally shared their work with colleagues around the world. More importantly, she discovered that many mathematical communications were conducted anonymously or under pseudonyms, particularly when dealing with theoretical work. The plan that formed in her mind was carefully constructed and ethically sound. She would act as an intermediary, carrying Marcus's mathematical work to the outside world under a pseudonym, and bringing back responses and feedback from the academic community. The work would be judged purely on its mathematical merit, with no knowledge of its controversial origin. When Margaret next visited Cell Block D for a routine medical check, she made sure to stop by Marcus's cell. He was surprised to see her, as their previous encounter had been several weeks earlier, and he had assumed it would be their only interaction. "I've been thinking about your mathematical work," she told him directly, cutting through any pleasantries. "I think you should know that what you're doing here is potentially very important." Marcus looked puzzled. "Important how? I'm just trying to keep my mind occupied." Margaret pulled out a folder she had prepared, containing printouts of academic papers and research summaries related to the problems he was working on. "The mathematical community is actively working on the same theorems you're tackling. There are researchers at Harvard, MIT, Cambridge, and Oxford who have been struggling with these problems for decades." She watched as Marcus carefully examined the papers, his eyes widening as he recognized the connection between his isolated work and the broader mathematical landscape. "These people are working on the exact same proof I've been developing," he said with wonder in his voice. "And according to what I've been able to research, your approach might be more advanced than theirs," Margaret added. "Some of the techniques you've developed appear to be completely original." Marcus sat down heavily, overwhelmed by the realization that his work might have value beyond his own personal rehabilitation. "But what does that mean? I can't exactly publish papers from prison. Who would take mathematical work seriously if they knew it came from a convicted criminal?" Margaret had anticipated this concern. "That's where I come in. I've researched the protocols for anonymous mathematical submissions. Many journals accept work under pseudonyms, especially for theoretical mathematics where the proofs speak for themselves." She outlined her proposal carefully. She would transcribe his work into proper academic format, submit it to appropriate journals under a carefully chosen pseudonym, and manage any correspondence with reviewers or editors. The mathematical community would evaluate his work based solely on its merit, without any knowledge of its origin. "You would do that for me?" Marcus asked, clearly moved by the unexpected offer. "Why would you take such a risk?" Margaret had asked herself the same question many times while developing her plan. "Because knowledge belongs to humanity, not to any individual. If you've made genuine mathematical discoveries, then the world deserves to benefit from them, regardless of where they came from." They spent the next hour discussing the practical details of how such a collaboration might work. Marcus explained his notation system, his methods for checking his work, and the specific theorems he believed he was closest to solving. Margaret took careful notes, realizing that she was essentially becoming a translator between two worlds that rarely intersected. "There's something else," Marcus said, as their meeting was drawing to a close. "Something I haven't told anyone, not even during my trial." Margaret waited, sensing that he was about to share something significant. "Before the accident, before I lost my family, I was working on a mathematical model that could predict certain types of traffic patterns and accident probabilities. If I had finished that work, if I had published it when I should have, it might have prevented accidents like the one that killed my wife and daughters. The irony was devastating. Marcus had possessed the mathematical knowledge that might have saved his own family, but had never pursued it far enough to make a difference. The tragedy that had destroyed his life might have been preventable through the very work he was now pursuing in isolation. That's another reason why this matters, Margaret said softly. Your work now might prevent other tragedies, might save other families. Marcus nodded, and Margaret could see the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. His mathematical pursuits were no longer just personal therapy or intellectual exercise. They had become a form of redemption, a way to contribute something positive to a world he had once sought to harm. As Margaret prepared to leave, Marcus handed her a notebook filled with his most recent calculations. If you're serious about this, then let's start with this proof. It's the one I'm most confident about, and it builds on work that several major universities have been struggling with for years. Margaret accepted the notebook with the solemnity of someone receiving a sacred trust. She was about to become the bridge between a brilliant mind trapped behind bars and a mathematical community that had no idea they were about to receive insights from the most unlikely of sources, the collaboration that was beginning. That day would challenge not only mathematical understanding, but also assumptions about rehabilitation, redemption, and the unexpected places where human genius might flourish. Margaret had no way of knowing that she was about to become part of mathematical history, facilitating discoveries that would eventually change the field forever. 6 months after Margaret began her secret collaboration with Marcus, the mathematical world was buzzing with excitement over a series of groundbreaking papers published under the pseudonym M. Dragon. The irony of the name choice wasn't lost on Margaret, who had suggested it as a way for Marcus to reclaim the identity that had once represented only violence and fear. The first paper, submitted to the Journal of Number Theory, had been accepted after an unusually enthusiastic peer review process. The reviewers had called the work revolutionary and a completely novel approach to classical problems. Within weeks, mathematicians around the world were attempting to build upon the foundations that Marcus had established. Margaret found herself in the surreal position of managing correspondence between some of the world's most prestigious mathematical institutions and a maximum security prison cell. She had become fluent in mathematical terminology, though the actual concepts often remained beyond her understanding. Her role was to ensure that Marcus's insights reached the academic community while protecting his identity and maintaining prison security protocols. The success of the first paper had given Marcus new purpose and energy. His cell had been transformed into what could only be described as a research laboratory, with every surface covered in increasingly complex calculations. The prison administration, unaware of his academic activities, simply saw this as evidence that the dragon was keeping himself occupied and causing less trouble than in previous years. The response to the prime number distribution paper has been extraordinary, Margaret told Marcus during one of their weekly meetings. Harvard wants to know if M. Dragon would be interested in collaborating with their number theory department. MIT is offering research funding for follow-up studies. Marcus looked up from the notebook where he was working on his latest proof, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It's strange to think that the same institutions that would never hire me as a convicted felon are now eager to work with my mathematical alter ego. Margaret had been thinking about this contradiction herself. Does that bother you? That they only value your work when they don't know who you really are? Not really, Marcus replied thoughtfully. Mathematics is pure in that way. The theorems don't care about the personal history of the person who proves them. A correct proof is correct regardless of whether it comes from a Nobel Prize winner or a convicted criminal. What Margaret didn't tell Marcus was that she had been conducting her own investigation into his background, trying to understand the full scope of the tragedy that had brought him to prison. She had discovered newspaper articles about the accident that killed his family, court records from his trial, and most surprisingly, references to his previous academic work. Dr. Marcus Chen had indeed been a respected mathematician before his conviction. His earlier papers had been cited hundreds of times, and colleagues had described him as one of the most promising researchers in his field. The loss of his contribution to academia had been noted in several professional journals, though none had known the full story of what had happened to him. There's something I need to tell you, Margaret said. pulling out a folder she had been carrying. "I've been in contact with Dr. Sarah Williams at Cambridge University. She's one of the leading experts in number theory, and she's been following the work of M. Dragon very closely." Marcus looked up with interest. "What does she want?" "She wants to nominate the prime number distribution paper for the Fields Medal consideration," Margaret said quietly. "It's the highest honor in mathematics, equivalent to a Nobel Prize." The impact of her words was immediate. Marcus sat down heavily, staring at the mathematical equations that surrounded him as if seeing them for the first time. "The Fields Medal? That's impossible. They don't give that award to anonymous mathematicians." Margaret had researched this as well. Actually, there have been cases where the medal was awarded posthumously or under unusual circumstances. What matters is the mathematical contribution, not the personal circumstances of the contributor. The possibility of such recognition was overwhelming for Marcus. He had spent years believing that his academic career was over, that his contributions to human knowledge had ended the moment he committed his crime. The idea that his current work might be considered worthy of the highest honors in mathematics was almost too much to process. "There's more," Margaret continued. "Dr. Williams has also expressed interest in solving some of the foundational problems in your traffic modeling research. She thinks the mathematical principles you were developing could revolutionize transportation safety systems." This was the breakthrough that Margaret had been hoping for. Marcus's original research, the work that might have prevented his family's tragedy, could finally see the light of day. Through his current mathematical achievements, doors were opening that might allow his earlier insights to benefit society. Marcus was quiet for a long time, processing the implications of what Margaret had told him. "If they knew who I really was, do you think they would still be interested?" Margaret had thought about this question many times. "I think the mathematical community might be more open-minded than you expect. Your story is one of redemption through intellectual pursuit. Some people might see that as inspiring rather than disqualifying, but others would see it as a convicted murderer trying to buy his way back into respectability," Marcus countered. "And they wouldn't be entirely wrong." Margaret leaned forward, looking directly at him. "The question isn't whether you deserve recognition for your past. The question is whether the world deserves to benefit from your discoveries. Your mathematical work could advance human knowledge, could prevent accidents, could save lives. Do you have the right to withhold that because of your personal shame?" The ethical complexity of the situation was weighing heavily on both of them. They were dealing with questions that had no clear answers, balancing justice and forgiveness, punishment and redemption, personal responsibility and social benefit. "What do you think I should do?" Marcus asked finally. Margaret had been preparing for this moment for months. "I think we should continue as we have been, at least for now. Let the work speak for itself. If the mathematical community wants to honor M. Dragon, then we can address the question of identity when we need to." As their meeting concluded, both Margaret and Marcus understood that they had reached a turning point. The secret collaboration that had begun as a way to help one man find purpose in his punishment had grown into something that might genuinely advance human knowledge. The mathematical proofs covering the walls of Cell 47 had become more than just intellectual exercises. They had become a bridge between a man's tragic past and the possibility of a meaningful future. The story of the Dragon was evolving from a tale of violence and retribution into something far more complex and hopeful. Margaret realized that she was no longer just helping one man work through his personal demons. She was facilitating a contribution to human civilization that might outlast them both. 2 years after that fateful evening when Margaret first entered Cell 47, the mathematical world was forced to confront an extraordinary revelation. The identity of Monsieur Dragon had become too significant to remain hidden, particularly after his work was formally recognized with several prestigious awards and his traffic safety algorithms had been implemented in major cities around the world. The revelation came not through Margaret's choice, but through an investigative journalist who had become curious about the mysterious mathematician whose work was revolutionizing multiple fields. Through careful research and persistent inquiry, she had traced the correspondence patterns and uncovered the truth about the collaboration between the old nurse and the imprisoned genius. When the story broke, it created a sensation that went far beyond academic circles. Here was a convicted murderer whose mathematical discoveries were saving lives, preventing the very type of accident that had destroyed his own family. The irony was so profound that it challenged fundamental assumptions about justice, redemption, and the potential for human transformation. Margaret found herself at the center of a media storm she had never anticipated. Reporters wanted to know how a nurse with no mathematical background had facilitated one of the most significant academic discoveries of the decade. Prison officials demanded explanations for how such an extensive collaboration had been conducted without their knowledge. The warden called Margaret into his office on a Tuesday morning, his face grave with the weight of the situation they now faced. "Did you realize what you were doing?" he asked. "Did you understand the implications of what you were facilitating?" Margaret had spent weeks preparing for this conversation. "I knew that I was helping a brilliant man contribute something positive to the world. I knew that his mathematical work could benefit humanity, regardless of his personal history. But you also knew that you were violating prison protocols, potentially compromising security, and certainly exceeding your authority as a medical professional," the warden pointed out. Margaret couldn't deny these charges. She had indeed operated outside normal procedures, had taken risks that could have endangered the security of the facility, but she had also witnessed something that she believed was too important to ignore. "What I saw in that cell wasn't just a dangerous criminal," she explained. "I saw a human being who had found a way to transform his pain and guilt into something constructive. His mathematical work represents one of the most profound examples of rehabilitation and redemption I've ever encountered." The public response to the revelation was divided, but largely supportive. Many people were moved by the story of a man who had used his time in prison to make genuine contributions to human knowledge. Scientists and mathematicians rallied to defend the value of Marcus's work, arguing that mathematical truth transcended personal circumstances. There were critics, of course. Victims' rights advocates argued that allowing a convicted murderer to gain recognition and acclaim, even for legitimate academic work, sent the wrong message about justice and accountability. Some questioned whether society should celebrate the achievements of someone who had taken a life, regardless of his subsequent contributions. Marcus himself was deeply conflicted about the attention his story was receiving. He had never sought recognition or redemption through his mathematical work. It had simply been his way of surviving and finding meaning in his incarceration. The sudden spotlight was overwhelming and unwelcome. "I never wanted any of this," he told Margaret during what they both knew might be their final meeting in cell 47. "Just wanted to work on problems that interested me, to use my mind for something constructive instead of destructive." Margaret understood his ambivalence. The story had taken on a life of its own, becoming a symbol of redemption and second chances that far exceeded the personal reality of one man, working through his guilt and grief. But there were also unexpected positive developments. Several universities had expressed interest in establishing correspondence programs with qualified inmates, recognizing that intellectual talent might exist in unexpected places. Prison reform advocates pointed to Marcus's story as evidence that rehabilitation programs should focus on education and skill development rather than purely punitive measures. Most significantly, Marcus's traffic safety algorithms had been implemented in 12 major cities, and preliminary data suggested they were preventing hundreds of accidents annually. The mathematical models he had originally conceived as a way to understand the tragedy that destroyed his family were now protecting other families from similar fates. The parole board that reviewed Marcus's case 2 years later faced an unprecedented situation. They had to weigh his original crime against not only his exemplary behavior during incarceration, but also his significant contributions to public safety and mathematical knowledge. Character witnesses included Nobel Prize winners, university professors, and safety officials whose cities had benefited from his work. Margaret, now retired from nursing but still serving as Marcus's academic liaison, testified at his parole hearing. She spoke about the transformation she had witnessed, the dedication to constructive work that had consumed his every waking hour for nearly a decade. "The man I first met in cell 47 was angry, dangerous, and consumed by guilt," she told the board. "The man I know today has channeled all of that energy into work that benefits humanity. He has served his sentence not just through the passage of time, but through the creation of something meaningful and lasting." When Marcus was granted parole, It marked the end of one chapter but the beginning of another. Several universities had offered him research positions, understanding that his unconventional path to mathematical achievement might bring unique insights to their programs. The story of the dragon had become something neither Margaret nor Marcus had ever expected when she first walked into that cell to treat an injured guard. It had evolved from a simple medical emergency into a profound meditation on the capacity for human change, the power of intellectual pursuit, and the complex relationship between justice and redemption. As Margaret watched Marcus walk out of the prison gates, carrying nothing but a single box of mathematical notebooks, she reflected on how 30 minutes in a maximum security cell had changed both their lives forever. The unthinkable had indeed happened. A man labeled as a monster had proved that even the most damaged among us might still have something valuable to contribute to the world. The equations that had once covered the walls of Cell 47 were now published in prestigious journals, implemented in safety systems around the world, and studied by the next generation of mathematicians. But perhaps more importantly, they stood as testament to the human capacity for transformation, proving that redemption might be found in the most unexpected places by those willing to look beyond the surface of what society labels as irredeemable.